So thank you very much again, Bernard, for the generosity, time, and effort for this interview, and also for the book. So I have a very introductory note about you, first of all, and then we will start with the questions. So Bernard Schweizer is a professor of English, or was a professor of English at Long Island University, Brooklyn. His most influential book to date, an interdisciplinary work titled Hating God, the Untold Story of Misotheism, is devoted to humanists who believe in God yet deny that he's benevolent. Schweizer's most recent book, back then Christianity and the Triumph of Humor, from Dante to David Javerbaum, traces the development of Christian religious comedy through the ages to show that humor was able to conquer all conceivable Christian taboos while delivering significant artistic and intellectual beliefs. Using history, literary criticism, theology, philosophy, and social science, Schweizer demonstrates that what began with grotesque scenes in Dante's Hell ended with unfettered comical irreverence in the work of David Javerbaum. He has also quite recently, co-edited a book, Muslims and Humor, essays on comedy, joking, and mirth in contemporary Islamic context. So the first question, I don't think it is by pure chance or coincidence that, having written quite prolifically on heresy, you started writing on humor, especially because I noticed that you have even published an article named The Heresy of Humor, Theological Responses of Laughter, or to Laughter. Is humor heretical?
It often is, but not always. So that was actually my starting point in a way of thinking about intersections between humor and religion. I thought that humor was always had this function of being subversive, irreverent, rebellious, and heretical, essentially. And so that it was a force directed against, maybe orthodoxy, a force against sanctimoniousness, against hypocrisy and cant and all that. So basically following what Mark Twain said about humor, or laughter rather. He said that laughter can basically conquer every obstacle and blow to smithereens all authorities. And I sort of took that quite literally as being the essence of humor, to be, counter-hegemonic, being subversive. And in that spirit, I really started to write my book, which ended up being titled Christianity and the Triumph of Humor. But then along the way, at some point, I realized, that's only part of the story. It depends what kind of humor you're talking about or you're, considering. Because there's definitely humor that, as I call it, has an entrenching function that reinforces stereotypes, that reinforces certain fixed ideas rather than loosening them up or countering authorities. You can definitely have racist, homophobic, misogynist jokes. And they are not subversive, right? They're not, in a sense, heretical, except if the going conformity is that you must be a feminist. If that is a conformity, that everybody has to be feminist in order to be considered a proper, well-functioning human being, then yes, from that basis, maybe you could say that a misogynist joke might be anti-conformist. But generally speaking, if we think of the going authorities and the dominant maybe beliefs in the world, and they're probably still, whatever those beliefs are, they depend, of course, on the community in which you move, right? If the belief is white supremacy, or if the belief is Christian, exclusionary Christian superiority, or the belief is ultra-Orthodox Judaic or the belief system is Muslim, or the belief system is woke, then yes, very often humor has a way of taking apart those fixed structures, because that is what humor often does. But I say often because I distinguish in my book between two basic types of humor. The one is the liminal type of humor, and that's the one we think of when we look at humor that we think is, anti-authoritarian, that is liberationist, that is anti-establishment, anti-authoritarian, subversive, heretical. Those are liminal kinds of humor that kind of shake at the foundations of certain very, firm belief systems and very fixed ideas. Humor has a way of softening these structures. But then you have the entrenchment humor, which can be, express itself through mockery, ridicule, and a milder form would be parody. You can have very, sort of sarcastic, bitter, mocking types of humor, whose function really is to reinforce existing beliefs, to strengthen that. That's why, rather than softening certain boundaries, they kind of erect the boundaries and make them stronger. These kinds of jokes, or this kind of wit or humor or laughter, comedy.
Right.
So those I think, that's a long-winded answer to your question. It depends, in other words, but I would still say that overall, the tendency of humor is to soften fixed structures of authority. That is generally, and I would say the kind of humor, comedy, jokes that reinforces existing fixed belief systems and hardens those structures is a bit of an exception.
So Bernard, one of the interesting points in the book that the book tries to let's say deconstruct is the relation between humor and Christianity in a very subtle way, and without overlooking the inherent clashes, or what you call the vexed relationship between the two. Where is the triumph of humor? And after all, it seems that it's not necessarily the triumph of humor over Christianity.
That's a good one. Yes. Basically, what I'm arguing is that humor culture, a given humor culture, reflects the wider socio-political culture of a society. In other words, if the wider society is restrictive, strongly follows traditional norms, or if the political system is very top-down authoritarian, then it doesn't really matter what the religion is of that place, whether it's Muslim or Orthodox Christian or Orthodox Jewish, or whatever system you want to link up with that authoritarian place. Humor is going to be problematic and frowned upon very often. Whereas if the culture is permissive and liberal in general, if you have a democratic society that's not top-down governed, that enjoys, liberal standards of behavior, where people are pretty much left alone to do as they please, where there's freedom of speech, in that kind of environment, then humor, is unfettered. It's less unfettered. So I wouldn't say that one religion opposes humor and another religion, fosters humor. It's really the wider socio-political environment that either has a humor depressing or suppressing effect, or a pro-humor, pro-comedy effect. And so what happened, of course, over the long term in the Christian West is that, we came from feudalism to constitutional democracy, and there were some reversals, but the curve is gradually going toward more liberalism, more freedoms of conscience, of speech. The Enlightenment, of course, is absolutely crucial in that regard. I think the triumph of humor probably would not have happened. We could also call it really the triumph of a liberal social culture that tolerates unfettered humor, right? We could call it that just as well. But without the Protestant Reformation, which promoted individualism, and without the Enlightenment that promoted constitutional, checks and balances and freedoms, I think we would not have the humor culture in the West that we have. And so, although Christianity and I shouldn't say Christianity, but the leading exponents of Christianity, leading authorities, have preached the dangers of laughter and have really vilified humor and joking as much as they could throughout the ages. Eventually, now humor is free to do pretty much anything it wants in the West. There hasn't been an attempt to rein in comedy from a purely religious standpoint. Now, of course, one can argue that nowadays, there's a new religion, if you will, kind of a social justice religion that it's identified as wokeness. And if you follow that train of thought, then you could say, okay, now there's again a humor depressing force that is very critical and wants to restrict joking for other reasons. Well, actually, the reasons are not that different. It's just the idea behind it is that jokes, are painful. Certain jokes directed at certain people create injustice, are painful and offensive, and therefore are immoral and should not be done, right? So we have that kind of force that counters the absolute unfettered freedom of comedy, which maybe we reached the apex somewhere around 2010, where it just absolutely, there was nothing you could not say in a comical way. There were no sanctities that were left, which could not be mocked or ridiculed. Whether they are religious or racial or gender or identity in any kind of sense, anything was up for joking at a certain point in the European American context. And now you have to be a little bit careful. What a problem.
So Bernard, you have provided a list of the works that best illustrate the gradual evolution of religious humor in Christian culture, including the following: Dante's The Divine Comedy, Boccaccio, the Decameron, Erasmus, In Praise of James Morrow, David Javerbaum. The list continues. And what does this list show? And do these works toward the end confirm the triumph of humor in your view?
Yes, so what I did is I broke down the larger topic of religious humor into specifically what is being targeted by a certain satire or a certain comical work of literature that is talking about literature. It's talking about religion. And yes, so my investigation is really based on literary texts, on works of literature, and I consider those as kind of a symptom of the larger society, or maybe an indication of what is happening in the society or the world, the culture from which this work emerges. So an indicator. For me, literature is an indicator of larger forces in a society, especially if you take a comparative long-term view of the matter. If you really look at literary history, I think some trends can be observed. And I wanted to see if I can observe a trend with regard to humorous treatments of religious topics. And in order to do that, I broke down religion as the target of humor into specific units, like are we talking about individual believers are the butt of a joke, like, you know, Jones and Smith, you know, or are we talking about maybe the target of the religious joke is a priest, is a clergy, member of the clergy, or are we talking about the target is the church organization, the Vatican, the Catholic Church as an institution? Are we talking about the target of the religious joke is scripture, an aspect of scripture, the Bible, the Gospels, the First Testament, the Second Testament, or is the target of the joke articles of faith, like the Trinity, or like the virgin birth? You know, is that the target of the joke? That's different. Whether we are making a joke about the Trinity or the virgin birth, maybe it's better to joke about, I guess. Whether we make a joke about the virgin birth is different from whether we joke about a man like Boccaccio, who is unfaithful to his wife, or rather, no, even better, a monk, you know, like a friar who is supposed to be celibate, but is sleeping around, right? Has women come to his cell, as Boccaccio's Decameron. So that kind of joke about the, you know, lecherous monk, the lecherous friar, still has a strong religious component. I mean, we're talking about a monk, or we're talking about a priest, but it's different from joking about the virgin birth, or it's different from joking about God, blasphemous humor, where, like, David Javerbaum's book is full of blasphemy.
Right.
He, you know, I mean, it's just, it would have been absolutely hair-raising what you read in Javerbaum, what, you know, he represents in his play An Act of God. God is on the stage, and he refers to himself as an effing moron and things like that. So that's another level yet. And then there's joking about religion as a whole, right? But religion as a belief system. All religion is laughable, right? Something like that. So I hierarchically ordered these different targets of the religious comedy, from low-level target individuals to the highest level target, which is all of religion is laughable and is ridiculous. Right? God is an idiot, you know, and those beliefs, you know, the virgin birth, it's just a complete joke. So if you look at longitudinally, what kind of targets were focused on earlier on in this development? So who did Boccaccio and Chaucer, what kind of targets did they aim their comedy at? What kind of targets did Voltaire aim his comedy at? What targets did Mark Twain aim his comedy at? What targets Václav Havel, and so on and so forth? And you can see that the targets get more and more and more high order, from individual believers to lower clergy, monks, lower clergy, bishops, Pope. At some point, Erasmus, the Pope, becomes the target of jokes. And then it goes to the church organization, and then articles of faith, and then a scripture, God becomes laughable, and religion as a whole. But that plays out over time. And so you can see how cumulatively one goal, one target after another is added over time. And I think I defined Mark Twain as being the first one really who fully aimed his barbs, his comical barbs at all from low to high at all of those targets. But then interestingly, it seems the more we come to the present, the lower level targets, those individual believers and monks and priests, it kind of dries up. The comedy is not so interested in those anymore. Now, today, the comedy is more interested in discrediting and making and ridiculing God or all of religion and church as an institution and things like that. So, yeah, in a sense, you could say that all the taboos that religion could have placed in front of humans, saying, okay, you can do this, but not that. You can, you can make fun of individual believers, maybe low-level, sinful priests and monks, that's okay. But you cannot go to the Pope, you cannot touch him with laughter. You can certainly not laugh about the Bible, right? Or God, let alone Yahweh, or Jesus. You can never laugh around about those. But over time, all of these taboos have fallen, and now you can joke about anything. So you could say that's a triumph of humor, but you could also say the joking that is possible reflects the larger freedoms that a society has or doesn't have.
Right.
Regardless of what religion is, is the majority of religion.
Right. Bernard, another notion that the book tries to challenge is that an understanding of comedy exists that affirms the idea that in most cases, humor is not a change agent. You quote Christy Davis, who believes that, I'm quoting, jokes are a thermometer. Not
thermometer. That's a wonderful analogy. It's the best analogy I know.
Yeah, you love it. Yeah. And yet I quote you, you say, in other words, jokes don't usually alter the climate of opinion or cause actual political outcome, but rather they indicate collective moods and diagnose prevailing attitudes. Indeed, any optimism about the supposedly subversive, anti-authoritarian, liberal power of humor is likely wishful thinking, just as the conviction that humor has reactionary, illiberal effects is probably overstated. End of quote.
Yes.
Yeah, do you also attribute such a role generally to humor today?
So humor is usually kind of a it lets it, it's a kind of a lightning rod, perhaps, right? It shows the prevailing mood. It reveals a prevailing mood, and it's a coping mechanism for sure. It also gives us perhaps a false sense of agency, right? Which is good for us, because if we are hateful of Trump and we feel oppressed by the idea that we need to live under this leadership, right? It's terrible. So what do? We joke, and it gives us a relief. So from that point of view, I'm following Freud's relief theory very much. It really is for our mental equilibrium. I think it is very important. I don't think the joking has done anything to take an iota of power away from Trump. And he was inundated by jokes for 4 years and still is, right? But he was the target. I mean, there's statistics. There were more jokes directed against Trump than any other president, and by a wide margin. Everybody joked about him. Cartoons, by the thousands against him. Did it do anything to undermine his power? No, I don't think so. But did it do something to make people just have a better mental state and feel some form of maybe self-empowerment, no matter how false, right, or unrealistic? But yeah, I think it's important as a coping mechanism. It really is. But yeah, it's a thermostat. It's a thermometer, sorry.
In theology of laughter, what's called theology of laughter, or in more modern understanding of humor, you seem not to be utterly satisfied with the good-bad humor binary opposition. You applied another model, as you mentioned earlier. I quote you, in general, the rhetoric of liminality tends to yield a humor that is playful, ironic, and subversive, based largely on the theories of incongruity and play as the principal triggers of laughter. By contrast, the rhetoric of entrenchment tends to be drawn to a type of humor that corresponds to the superiority and relief theories of laughter, end of quote. Could you please elaborate this four-factor humor model that you introduce in the book?
Yeah, so basically the generally accepted theories of humor, but they're also sometimes called theories of laughter, are fourfold. And normally most people refer to three only: the superiority theory, incongruity theory, and relief theory. I add the play theory, which I think is absolutely crucial. To think of humor without the play element, it just doesn't make much sense. And none of these theories covers all humor. It's a Venn diagram, right? So certain types of jokes, expressions of humor are definitely, satisfy the relief theory. Others satisfy the superiority theory. Most probably instances of humor would satisfy the incongruity theory. That's the best one overall, I think. And then there's the play theory, which also goes in with Bakhtin, right? When we play carnival, we're also a kind of carnivalist. Carnival theory is a kind of a play theory, but also relief theory. So that's kind of wedged in between there. So I just looked at those four theories and I said, well, they really fall into two larger categories. The one is the liminal, where we think of humor as, playing and softening existing boundaries, kind of symbolical or cognitive or conceptual boundaries, softening things up. And so being liminal in that sense. So incongruity and play are doing that, whereas relief, how often are we or are people really venting some kind of pent-up frustration when they're cracking racist or misogynistic jokes? That's really a form of relief. And superiority, of course, those two are linked together. So that's why and then even because I make it a fourfold structure, so on the top are the two liminal types, and I say two liminal types because one is softer than the other. If we go into satire, hard-hitting satire, then and subversive humor, then we are on the side of the harder liminal humor. But there are also in this fourfold structure on the bottom are these entrenching forces, which can be perfectly harmless. If you look at parody, what is parody then saying, I'm just mocking something mildly for its typical characteristics, right? If you mock a James Bond movie aesthetic, or you mock something else, or you make a parody of another literary work, you exaggerate its typical characteristics. It's salient characteristics. So that's also a force of entrenchment. You're exaggerating something. And then, of course, the bottom right of that quadrant, the bottom right quadrant would be really the hard and hard-edged and mean. Quite frankly, can be really mean and potentially harmful and intended to be harmful, kind of attack dog humor, right? So I think it's really useful to think of humor in that way, because it is not the case that one joke is only in one of those quadrants, or that one work of literature or one comedy performance, let's say Dave Chappelle, is all in one quadrant, the whole performance. No, his performance moves through different of these quadrants. He has a bit of this, he has a bit of that, and so on. And the same with literary works, the same with the whole output. As I demonstrate in my book, some authors are more strongly on the hard side, others are more on the liminal side, others are more on the entrenching side. But even within one joke, you can find elements, or maybe one funny passage, I should say, you can find elements of liminal and entrenching, some soft, some hard. So humor is not a fixed, easily definable thing, but is at the same time also not undefined and completely, limitless and open to all interpretations. I think we can say it's useful to think of this typology, but also see that humor is a kind of a mercurial thing. I like to say it's very mercurial. So that's why you cannot say this comedian is harmful, or this comedian is just, even if you use my terminology, he is just a mocking, entrenching, sarcastic, kind of offensive comedian, because most likely he has some jokes that would fit into the other categories as well. So just canceling him or her because of one or two bad jokes means you then also get rid of all the other good stuff that, the good stuff, maybe, that's all objective, it's all subjective. But if, you also then unfortunately shut yourself off from other forms of humor, which you would have no problem with and which society needs. I think society absolutely needs humor. And if we are steering toward a humorless society because we are afraid of the hard, entrenching material, then we will also lose the other three quadrants, I think. Right.
So Bernard, in my visits to Iran, which over last 13 years, whenever I was home and coming back to Germany, I was sort of proudly talking to my German friends that, look, in Iran, we have a lot of humor. I mean, when I'm in the taxi, I'm just talking to people, I'm enjoying the humor, but here people are, in my view, humorless. I was quite proud of it. And then when I came to these parts of the book, when you are again talking about humor as a change agent, you're quite ambivalent about the power in humor to change. Again, I'm referring back to that. After all, humor is mainly something to cope with a crisis rather than overcoming it. And then I thought, okay, perhaps we need more humor in Iran because we need more humor to cope with the situation. Yet it's quite challenging to me when you refer to Patrick Metziger's work, which, as you put it, I'm quoting you, has turned up evident that the Nazis actually encouraged people to make jokes about the government, hoping that it would diffuse misgivings about the Nazi policies. So I'm not comparing that immediately with the situation in Iran, but as a result, you say that something such as Flusswitz or whispered joke does not have the faintest influence in politics.
Yeah, indeed. We wish that that they did, but it's you could even argue that not only is this kind of joking about authorities not subversive, it actually helps these authorities stay in power because it diffuses the opposition, the oppositional impulse for real change, for real political change. It's diffused because we joke about it and then the anger or the activist impulse kind of is gone. So you could even go to that level.
Sorry to interrupt you, but can we say that the relief understanding of humor is the most apolitical form of humor?
The
relief mechanism in humor.
Yes, it can. Yes, absolutely. This kind of the relief or the quietistic or quietistic effect of humor can be really anti-activist in a sense, because it just provides comfort where there wasn't before. But on the other hand, we really need that. What's the alternative, right? Can we go to Washington and protest in front of the Supreme Court building and think that Roe v. Wade will be re-overturned, right? Roe v. Wade will come back? I don't think so. It takes a long, long time for this, maybe another 50 years. before it comes back. What do we do in those 50 years, right? We are just depressed, we're angry, or we can lighten the load by, doing other measures, of course, practical measures, not on a national level, on a state level, and just diffuse our frustration with humor. So we need that. We absolutely need that. Otherwise, we might really, who knows, without jokes, we might already have the civil war in America that everybody is talking about, is imminent. But I think both sides joking about the other side is very, very important. Democrats joking about Republicans, Republicans or conservatives joking about Democrats. It's very important, super important.
On the other hand, I had back then when I was writing my dissertation, I had this somehow intuitive, not utterly reflected idea about humor, that there is an inverse correlation between humor and democracy. Do you agree? I mean, the more democracy we have, the less humor we need.
Well, okay. I would modify that. It depends on what kind of humor. The very, subtle humor, the wit, the subtle wit, the more democracy you have, it seems, the more the subtle wit just sort of begins to disappear, because that's the only weapon that people in China or other places have, right? If they want to really laugh at the authorities for their own, mental health and relief benefit, they have to be very, very, very subtle. Whereas in our Western democracies, you can, apply, instead of with a tiny little brush, you can apply a big, broad brush and just paint things with that. That's also a great form of humor, right? The one that's loud-mouthed and potty-mouthed and totally just in your face kind of joking and comedy, the Dave Chappelle type. I guess, that's also only possible in a society that's quite free, but it is true, there is a dialectic. You could say that humor thrives best under circumstances where not everything goes, where it's a kind of a risque, right, to say certain things. But if everything goes, then sort of we kind of lose the frisson of joking, because if you're permissive, living in an extremely super permissive society, you don't notice what is not permitted anymore. Whereas if there's a dialectic between the permitted and the not permitted, the joke usually goes to the not permitted and niggles that a little bit. Or if there's the opposition between the sacred and the profane kind of encroaches on the sacred. But let's say the sacred is completely gone one day. People no longer believe in anything sacred. So this whole domain of religious joking and all this daring to take on these religious concepts and dogmas, it's gone, right? We can no longer really have that kind of tension of it's just niggling, to bring to burst the bubble, with humor.
Right. In a book, or in the book titled "That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them," Matt Sinekowicz, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, argues that, I'm quoting him, in the fractured world of contemporary media and culture, however, right-wing comedy need not dominate or even cross into the mainstream in order to shape American society and politics profoundly. In fact, it may be all the more effective because it goes nearly unnoticed by the liberal world. Right-wing comedy has reached a point of economic sustainability and significant influence. The future of liberal politics, we argue, depends in part on facing right-wing comedy, recognizing its economic success and acknowledging its aesthetic appeal for conservative viewers. End of quote. That's not funny. The book is an attempt to analyze the right-wing comedy. Do you agree that the right wing does have comedy? I think you do. I mean, you already mentioned that. And if so, do you think it is worthwhile to analyze?
Well, that may have changed since I did my research. I was really trying to look for right-wing comedians. At the time I did this was between 2015 and 17. At the time, it was almost impossible to find really decent right-wing comedy that was, other than a few outliers who managed to be somewhat entertaining. There was the, what was his name again? I see him in front of me. He used to work for Saturday Night Live. I probably mentioned him somewhere. Maybe it'll come back to me, but he turned into a conservative comedian. I thought his joking was very mediocre. And I read a couple of Evan Sayed, for instance, or maybe it's pronounced Evan. Evan Sayed is a right-wing comedian. Oh my God, it's so predictable and just without nuance, really, just flat out, if Nancy Pelosi looks in the mirror, that's what she sees. How much more eyeshadow do I need or something? It's just wasn't funny. It was not funny to me. Okay, I guess it's always subjective, but I thought it was terrible. And that may have changed since then. I could imagine, but of course, now you have people labeled as right-wing the minute they say something which doesn't fit, a certain, maybe, I don't know, liberal or progressive agenda or mainstream. So people who used to be thought of as not conservative or right-wing at all, like Dave Chappelle, I guess they would now be considered right-wing because of their stance against, transgender people, or Kevin Hart or Sarah Silverman. I guess all these people could be considered New York liberals, and yet because of some of their opinions, they are now labeled as right-wing. So I would first need to see what is the definition of right-wing before you then look at the comedy that they produce. I unfortunately have not read the book. That's not funny. It's a little bit, the title itself is a bit telling because who's to say, right? Who's to say whether laughter finds you or not? Laughter is not something that you premeditate. Laughter finds you, and the minute you laugh, something has tickled your funny bone. Now, it might be that the thing that tickled your funny bone, later on you realize was actually not something you should have laughed about, because it didn't correspond with your belief, maybe, or your political ideology, and yet you still found it. Somehow the laughter found you. So this involuntary aspect, you cannot tell people what is funny and not, because that's just their own individual, personal, subjective reaction to something.
Bernard, I think we have just a couple of minutes for one last question, and then and that is, in the last chapter of the book, you argue that, quoting you, religion and humor make the odd bedfellows. Although suspicious of each other, they are quite inseparable. While humor does not normally contribute to heightened reverence, it can serve as a catalyst or transcendental insight, for example, in Zen Buddhism, or function as a conduit to a counterworld, the essence of holy foolishness. You argue that liminal propensity is what is common between humor and religion. Could you please elaborate it as the last question?
Well, I'm very much leaning on Peter Berger, the Redeeming Laughter book here, where he argues, I think persuasively so, that there's something transcendental about humor, especially humor that does not aim at the gut exclusively, but humor that is intellectual, is witty, or punny, you know, irony, those kinds of things. They tend to shift your perspective in ways that suddenly make you inhabit another world with different laws, right? Where the laws of our everyday logic do not hold. You know, what does the goldfish say to the other in the tank? How do you drive this thing? Oops, you know, now I make this switch, this conceptual switch. Oh, tank. All right. It has the same spelling. It has two meanings, right? And how can a fish find itself in a military, motorized military vehicle anyway? You know, it's just you're living, suddenly you inhabit another world in which a goldfish is driving a military motorized vehicle. And for a moment, you live in that reality. That's real for you. And because you were jolted out of the normal reality where a goldfish would say this only in a fish tank, and even there you would not have speaking fish, but let alone, right, ones that drive a tank. So I think we are just momentarily jolted into this other reference system. And for a moment, we inhabit this reference system. And to Peter Berger, this is a transcendental leap. And this happens all the time when we make a really good joke, or we play around with each other, we tease each other. For a brief moment, we inhabit an alternate world. And what is that other than a kind of a transcendent, almost like mystical, getting out of yourself and inhabiting an alternative world, speculative world. So, and then of course you have you know, the situations in the scriptures that sometimes, well, no, let's not even go to situations, scriptures like the book of Jonah, where you can say, you know, this is just the Pinocchio story in the Bible. But let's go to Kierkegaard, who said that Christianity is the origin of humor because it's built entirely on incongruity. You know, the savior of the world coming down as a little baby, a wailing little baby on earth, you know, a God who is tortured to death by humans, you know, who is mortal. It's the incongruity par excellence, a virgin giving birth to God. I mean, it's total incongruity. It's so unexpected, yet we get used to it, right? So you have to defamiliarize that sometimes and say, well, you know, it's actually really happening here. And so that's what Rowan Atkinson does in his famous, you know, comedy routine, The Wedding at Cana, you know, the turning the water into wine scene, where he just treats this as a magic trick. And then it's defamiliarized enough that we see, yes, there is an incongruity here that is kind of humorous. So I would say that religion really attracts humor because of these elements, these kind of really incongruous elements. It attracts humor like a magnet.
Right. Right. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Bernard.